Okay, Alexander, let's talk about the end of the war. And the U.S. is out, the last troops left, and the Biden White House is spinning this, oddly enough, or I guess it's expected that they're spinning this as a success. The Biden White House, actually, Jen Psaki said that no one's going to be reprimanded or asked to resign or fired off of this. She was actually given that question by a reporter, and she said, "Nope, straight up, no consequences for what happened." McKenzie, the general, said, that they got all the Americans out. Blinken came on a couple of hours afterwards and said they didn't get all the Americans out. There's still a couple of hundred left. He says around 100, but less than 200. So I guess they really don't know, but they're going to use diplomatic efforts to get them out. And the Biden White House came out with a statement, which I'll pull up after you comment on my intro, and then I'll pull up the Biden statement and actually read it to you as to how they're spinning this as a success. So your first thoughts? Officially the war is over, but God, I think the chaos is just beginning. Alexander.
Well, very, very likely. But can I just say, first of all, on the business about it being success, there is a story from ancient Greece about a king who fought various battles, and all his courtiers congratulated him on his successes in those battles. And he said, another victory like that, and we're finished. We're absolutely destroyed, because these kind of victories, I mean, you can call this, the idea of calling this a victory is surreal. I mean, even the best media manipulator, spin doctor, PR, marketing genius cannot claim this is anything else than a disaster. And it's a disaster at two levels. It's a disaster because the overall war was a disaster. The Taliban is back. The US went in 2001 to throw it out. The entire attempt to create a functioning democracy, or whatever it was going to be, in Afghanistan has failed. The entire governmental structure that the United States created in Afghanistan, spent trillions of dollars supporting. The entire army the United States spent supporting has been completely destroyed. It collapsed within the space of a couple of days and weeks. The entire position of the United States in Central Asia has collapsed. American influence in that region has been destroyed too. And of course, if we're looking at the immediate events, well, we have the most chaotically disorganized and appallingly mismanaged evacuation from Kabul, which one could have imagined. I mean, one has to say that the American soldiers, the soldiers who were on the ground, apparently did their work bravely and honorably and with great humanity, but they were put into an impossible position by their leaders. And, it was an absolute wreck, and lots of people have been left behind. But spin is the one thing this administration knows how to do, or at least does all the time. It's been the case ever since the 1990s, when spin basically took over from real policy. It no longer matters whether you win or lose. All that matters is if you can persuade enough people that you have won, even when you have lost, and if you can spin it in the media as you have won, even if you have actually lost. So, of course, they're saying this is a success. This has all gone incredibly well. This has exactly happened. Everything happened according to some great plan. And of course, nobody is going to be blamed, because in the United States, and not just in the United States, but throughout the West, if you are a soldier who mislays his weapon, you're going to be harshly disciplined. But if you're a general who loses a battle, or if you're a president who loses a war, or if you're a secretary of state who gets humiliated in a diplomatic exchange, or if you're a central banker who completely mucks up, all that happens is you get promoted. That's the reality of the world today. That is what we're going through in the West. It is unsustainable. It is appalling. It is hideous. But if you want a single reason why the United States lost in Afghanistan, which it did, that is why. Because instead of acting on realities. We are now chasing headlines. And that's really all that we do now. We're all about the headlines, the story on MSNBC tomorrow, the headline in the New York Times, the commentary piece in the Washington Post, the editorial in the Guardian. That's all that we're really focused on. Real war and real peace, real economies, all those things, they no longer matter. So frankly, what we've just been hearing from Washington is all of a piece, and I would have been intensely surprised if it had been otherwise, if the president had come along and said, we've suffered a defeat, and if anybody had been sacked because of the consequences of it.
Yeah, let me read you the statement, and two things really stood out from my end as I read the statement. This is the Biden White House statement released on Monday evening after the Pentagon confirmed that the last U.S. planes had left Kabul. And I quote, "I want to thank our commanders and the men and women serving under them for their execution of the dangerous retrograde from Afghanistan as scheduled in the early morning hours of August 31st, Kabul time, with no further loss of American lives," end quote. Two things that stood out to me. Evacuation from Afghanistan, and I quote, as scheduled. As scheduled by who?
Yeah, by the Taliban.
You'll get into that.
Yeah.
And then the second part that really shocked me when I read it was, with no further loss of American lives. My God.
Yeah, I know.
What a statement, Alexander. What do you make of this?
Well, what an incredible statement. Now, let's take the first one. Now, of course, it was the president, the administration, Biden himself, who originally said they were going to pull out by September 11th. Then they put the date forward to 31st August, when it began to seem as if things were going to go wrong. And, of course, then they tried to persuade the Taliban to change that date, to give them a couple of more weeks in Kabul so as to complete the evacuation which we're now told is complete. And the Taliban said no, and the Taliban made it clear that all the troops had to leave by the 31st of August, and so they have. So it is the Taliban who have dictated the timetable. They dictated the original change in the timetable from 11th September to 31st August because they won all that string of victories unexpectedly against the Afghan army that collapsed like a cake. And they also dictated the current timetable, because when the United States, when the British and the French, when asked for an extension, when Biden sent the head of the CIA, no less, to speak to them, to beg for an extension, they said no. So it is their timetable, backed by their ultimatum. They have controlled the entire operation in terms of its time, and it is their schedule and not ours. What was it that they were always used to say? That time works for us. You may have your schedules, but we have the time. That's proved true right to the bitter end. Now, for the President of the United States to talk about the fact that they've had no more further loss of life after 13, perhaps 14, I've heard different numbers, American soldiers were killed over the course of this evacuation, after lots of other people were killed, after American citizens are still in Afghanistan with their lives at risk. To hear the President of the United States talking that way, I mean, that is manipulative language. That is simply not a proper accounting of the facts. And I'm picking my words again extremely carefully, as our viewers will undoubtedly have noticed. I mean, it's an astonishing thing to say. Now, if you go back in history, go back in time, you heard Winston Churchill after Dunkirk. He goes up to the House of Commons. He says, "We've suffered a massive reverse. Wars are not won by evacuations." He told the truth. When the Battle of Singapore was lost and thousands of British soldiers surrendered, he came to the House of Commons again and he said, "We have suffered a defeat." That is what a real leader does. He tells the people, his people, the truth. He tells them the facts. And maybe they will blame him, and maybe they won't. But if they trust him in his judgment, they will support him. But one way or the other, this president, this administration doesn't have that strength and doesn't have that courage to do that. And instead, we have this, I'm going to say, distorted language, this complete twisting of language in order to make black look like white, to make failure seem like success, to pretend that there'll be no casualties when we know that there not only have been, but will be more, and to pretend that we've acted according to our timetable when the timetable has been set not just by someone else, but by the adversary whom we have been fighting. So, I mean, I have to say, it really upset me to listen to it. It didn't just upset me, it made me angry. And I'm sure a lot of Americans feel like that. And I'm sure a lot of the American troops who were there at Kabul airport and who know the truth must feel very angry also.
Yeah, and of course, in my opinion, obviously Biden is not the person crafting these statements. It's the communication department and the spin department in DC. But my God, I've been saying it since the beginning, the worst communications department in White House history, because that statement was just not appropriate at all. But anyway, let's move on now, Alexander, because we have a lot of things that were left behind, people and equipment. The general says that the troops have left. Blinken comes on a couple hours later and says, not really. We have, once again, less than 200. More than around 100 was Blinken's accounting of the situation. Even if there's one person, one American, 100, 200, there are Americans in Afghanistan that, according to the Biden White House and the Secretary of State, will now be evacuated with diplomatic means. You can get into that. And then the second issue, which I think everyone is talking about, and it's coming out of the UK, which is a graph from the Times and the Sunday Times. I get very confused as to the difference, or as to what those two are.
There isn't any. The Sunday Times is just the Sunday version of the Times. They do employ some different journalists, but overall they're the same organisation.
Okay, so the Times and the Sunday Times has a graph that's going viral, and it is according to data shared by the U.S. Government Accounting Office, the GAO, and the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, showing that the Taliban fighters have their hands on an enormous arsenal of weapons. I'll put the graph up right now so people can take a look. I also put the graph on our locals community, Alexander, to get everyone's feedback and thoughts as to why such equipment was left in Afghanistan. And we're not talking about 10 Humvees, a chopper, and 15 rifles. I mean, we're talking 22,174 Humvees, 8,000 trucks, 16,000 night vision goggles, 358,000 assault rifles, 126,000 pistols, 42,000 trucks and SUVs, 64,000 machine guns, 33 Mi-17 helicopters, 33 UH-60 Blackhawks, 43 MD-530 helicopters, 28 Cessna 280s. Anyway, 4 C-130 transports. My God. What the hell's going on here?
No, I mean, it goes on and it gets worse. But firstly, let's talk about the communications department, because you're absolutely right. The quality of the communication staff in the White House is abysmal, but it simply reflects the abysmal quality of the entire administration. Now, I think the reason why the communication staff in the White House is so bad is actually really very simple. They haven't needed a good media operation in the White House because they relied on the mainstream media to do their work for them. They haven't really had to go out and explain the president's policies or the administration's policies or Joe Biden's policies, because throughout the time that he has been first a candidate and then the president, all they've ever got are fawning articles and softball questions. So they've never had to really organise themselves there, because their true media department is not the one in the White House. It has been the one in mainstream media. Now, that has turned on them. I mean, it's had to, because otherwise it would have lost whatever remaining tatters of credibility it had left. And the result is that the absolute hollowness of this operation at its centre has now been exposed. And I don't think you're ever going to put this particular, Humpty Dumpty together again. I think the idea that you can somehow go back to the world we had a few weeks ago, when the president could mumble something in a press conference and we'd read the following day that he's a genius, I think those days are well and truly and forever lost. I think they will, they'll continue to support him, they'll continue to protect him to the extent that they can, but they can never pretend again that he is the political colossus, the great intellectual, the decent, experienced, worldly, competent adult in the room leader that they were making out that he was. So that illusion has now been shattered, and as a result, we've also seen the hollowness of the operation at its core. Now, about that military, the Russian defense minister has been making more comments about this. He said that the Afghan army is actually, or was actually, better equipped than the Ukrainian army was. That's what he said. I mean, this vast flood of equipment in Afghanistan, to what purpose and to what end? You're fighting a rural insurgency with Toyota pickup trucks and Kalashnikov rifles. And you need all this vast machinery in order to combat it. And of course, bear in mind that they had drones, they had, help from the US, data links, all that kind of thing. And of course, the equipment needed for all of that, the electronic equipment, the radio equipment, the direction finders, all of that, the computer systems, they're all still in Kabul also. And they can be directly accessed, not just by the Taliban, but by other countries, by the Chinese, by the Russians. They're going to be talking now already to the Taliban, and they want to send their own people, their own technicians into Afghanistan to see exactly what all this American equipment, how it works, what it does, how it operates, what the interfaces are. And there's one particular weapon system that apparently the Russians especially are particularly interested in, which is apparently the US was also supplying to the Afghan army Javelin anti-tank missiles. And these have been spoken about by the US as a game changer in tank warfare. And of course, the Russians are going to be particularly interested in all of that. So why was all this equipment sent? What was going on? Well, I think, again, we see in all of this the true nature of this war, because the Afghan military was grotesquely overarmed. In fact, it was weighed down by this massive equipment that it couldn't absorb, and much of which it couldn't effectively use, and which in fact made it leaden-footed and unwilling to go out of its bases and take on the Taliban in the villages and the hills and the mountains where it needed to fight. And the reason there was this vast flood of weapons into Afghanistan was because ultimately this entire war was a money creation exercise for the MIC and for all the various contractors. And so the result was that, of course, there was no limit, actually, no upper limit on the kind of weaponry you would send there. So, where they might have needed 150 Humvees, well, you sent 22,000 of them. I mean, where they might have been better off with a few helicopters, you pile in and you send the most sophisticated and advanced helicopters. Because ultimately, this is the gravy train around which the MIC, the military-industrial complex, and the various contractors all work. And that was, of course, another reason why the war was ultimately lost, because this was not a real war-fighting operation. It was, for many people, a money-making operation. And ultimately, that is why we have this bloated, incompetent military fighting in Afghanistan, weighed down with all this equipment it couldn't use, and ripe for the picking by the Taliban, and now by those Russian and Chinese specialists and Iranian specialists who are going to be crawling all over the country trying to lay their hands on all the latest weapon systems that the United States produces.
Yeah, those javelins are probably very useful for the Russians to get a look at, because I imagine those are the same weapons that were supplied to Ukraine as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is exactly right. That is exactly the case. And that's why the Russians are going to be very interested in those javelins. And you can be sure that that they're bargaining to get their hands on them with the Taliban now, and be absolutely sure they will. I mean, they will do so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. They're going to get those weapons, and they're going to reverse engineer them from top to bottom, left to right. There were a couple of comments on locals when I posted that chart, which go along the lines of what you said. Those weapons were left in Afghanistan for two main reasons. The first main reason was the fact that this was a money-making exercise, and you can't bring those weapons back to the United States because, well, there's never really been a full audit as to how much money was spent in Afghanistan. If you bring those weapons back to the United States with their serial numbers and with all the information behind them, then you would probably get some really off-balance books. Things would kind of go haywire there. So just leave all that inventory there, and let's just not discuss it. The second reason that those weapons might have been left there, which may be, just kind of a benefit to the military-industrial complex outside of the fact that you don't have to bring the weapons back to the U.S. and you don't have to do an audit and kind of look at how the money was spent, is that you'll leave those weapons in the region and a lot of chaos can ensue. I mean, I'm sure these weapons are not only going to be used by the Taliban or given by the Russians, but I'm sure that these weapons will make their way to certain groups in the Middle East, to certain groups in Central Asia. Maybe the neocons think those weapons could be used to sow some chaos in the Caucasus and thus cause some problems for the Chinese and the Russians, or maybe be used in Syria and cause problems there. And, another 5, 10, 20 years of chaos, which is always good business, once again, for the MIC. What do you think?
Absolutely. Well, can we just first of all deal with the economics and the logistics of all of this? Of course, ferrying back all these vast mountain of weapons to the United States would have been a very complex logistical exercise. And we've seen that whatever this evacuation was, it was not a well-run logistical exercise. But quite apart from anything else, you're absolutely right. If you bring all these weapons back to the United States, two things start to happen. First of all, people inevitably are going to ask why. Why were so many weapons supplied to Afghanistan? And what do they do? So you cover your tracks by leaving them there. And that's the obvious thing you do. I mean, it's like, sort of people who, in Italian cities and not just in Italy, but in all sorts of places, when the tax investigators, the fraud investigators come round, they set the warehouse on fire. So in a way, this is the equivalent of it. And of course, the other thing is, I mean, if you are the MIC, obviously the very last thing you want are thousands of spare Humvees in the United States, which might argue for producing fewer Humvees, because given you've got so many already in the United States, what do you need more Humvees for? So, losing thousands of them means that, you can actually get a contract to make even more. Just saying. As it happens, I think the US is gradually abandoning the Humvee for all kinds of reasons, and no doubt part of the reason so many were sent there was because they wanted to dump it. But that's one possibility. But I mean, it seems to me the underlying reason. You don't want the weapons back. You don't want the weapons recycled into the US military, because of course that will interrupt the gravy train of continued production. But your third point is entirely a valid one, because this mountain of weapons is not going to go unused. I mean, weapons always end up being used, almost by definition. And over the next couple of years, and going back to that comment you made right at the start of the programme, we're going to see all kinds of things happening. We're going to see M16s and Humvees and all kinds of weapon systems, who knows, even javelins, turning up in all kinds of places in Central Asia, in the Middle East, everywhere you like. Part of that will, of course, serve US policy, or at least neocon policy. Let's call it US policy. Let's call it neocon policies, creating more instability in places like the Caucasus, Central Asia, Western China, who knows where, Iran maybe. Some of it also may be used against the United States in places like Iraq and Syria with, IS has its franchise in Afghanistan. They'll be out to get their hands on some of these weapons. They could end up in the Middle East too. But bear in mind that if your outlook is that of a neocon, what you want is more chaos around the world. What you want is more chaos in the Middle East, because if you can convincingly say that some kind of terrorist group is a real threat because they're so well armed, you can argue for more war to counter them. So in a way, even if those weapon systems end up being used against American interests, they still serve a overriding neocon objective, which is to sustain war.
We'll leave it there.
Anyway, we live in very interesting times, and my goodness, this is a debacle of the like I've never seen. Can I just say something? When another important difference between Afghanistan and Vietnam is that, of course, Vietnam had a structured government. The communist government that took over, it might have been, a government that you were totally opposed to, but it was an actual government. It had a proper chain of command. When they took over, when they seized all the massive amounts of American weapons there, they had them under control. Taliban are not like that. They're a coalition of groups, some of them very dangerous and very hardline, some of them allied with all sorts of scary groups that are even more dangerous than they themselves are. So this mass of weapons that's in Afghanistan, it's going to flow out of Afghanistan at the same rate like as refugees and drugs do. And that's the truth.
And we didn't even touch upon refugees and drugs. But
no.
Maybe that's for another time.
Well, indeed.
For another time and another video.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think we've talked about enough disasters for one
Absolutely.
segment.
Absolutely. Anyway,
right.
it keeps us busy.
Yeah. The Duran.locals.com, as I mentioned in the video, there was a lot of good information at our community, the Duran.locals.com. And go to BitChute, Rumble, SuperU, and Odyssey. We will post this video and all our videos go on those awesome platforms as well. And Alexandra, the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code REALNEWS. I've got 3 Duran. You've got 2. I got hats, shirt, and a magic mug. You've got long sleeve. That's a long sleeve.
A long sleeve, absolutely, because it's actually quite cold in London. It can be quite cold at the end of August. Last day of August today, and in fact, the weather is actually quite cold. And it's, by the way, long sleeves are ideal for London weather because I say when it does get a bit cold, you can walk around and you don't want anything too heavy, and this is just right.
All right, the Duran shop. You'll find the link down below. Take care.